They said the black wolf feared nothing, but they never wondered what the monster feared every full moon. The wind carried that whispered legend through the towering pines as clouds slowly drifted away from the enormous full moon hanging above the kingdom. Silver light spilled across the mountains, the palace walls, and the endless forest below until every shadow seemed alive. High above the valley, standing alone on the edge of a weathered cliff, an enormous black wolf lifted its head toward the glowing sky. Its thick midnight fur shimmered beneath the moonlight, and its powerful frame remained perfectly still except for the slow rise and fall of its breathing. Brilliant steel-gray eyes searched the silent wilderness, filled not with hunger, but with exhaustion so deep it almost resembled sorrow. Far below, every gate leading to the royal castle had already been locked before sunset. Guards quietly doubled their patrols without speaking the reason aloud. Curtains were drawn in every nearby village, fireplaces burned a little brighter, and parents gently guided their children away from windows whenever the full moon appeared. They all believed the same frightening story. Once every full moon, the Alpha King vanished, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, the black wolf walked beneath the stars. No one dared ask how those two mysteries had always happened on the very same night. Deep inside the forest, however, one small lantern continued moving between ancient oak trees. Claire Bennett carefully followed the narrow trail she had walked countless times before, carrying a woven basket filled with freshly gathered herbs that only bloomed beneath moonlight. She knew most people believed the forest belonged to dangerous spirits after dark, but she had never learned to fear quiet places. Nature had always offered her more kindness than people ever had. The cool night breeze brushed against her golden blonde hair, while moonlight reflected softly within her green eyes. Every few steps, she paused to listen, not because she expected danger, but because the forest always seemed to whisper secrets to those patient enough to hear them. Suddenly, every cricket fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. Claire slowly looked toward the rocky ridge ahead as an unfamiliar presence settled over the clearing. There, standing between towering pine trees, the massive black wolf emerged from the shadows without making a sound. It was larger than any creature she had ever imagined, its dark coat glowing beneath the silver moon while its steady gaze met hers across the open ground. Stories claimed the black wolf destroyed everything in its path, yet the creature before her did not move. It simply watched. Claire noticed something unexpected hidden behind those powerful eyes. They carried unbearable loneliness instead of rage. Her heartbeat quickened, but she did not run. Without realizing why, she slowly lowered the basket of herbs onto the ground and took one careful step forward. The wolf remained perfectly still. For one endless moment, neither human nor beast looked away. Then a distant church bell echoed across the valley, breaking the silence. The enormous wolf turned its head toward the sound before disappearing into the darkness with astonishing speed, leaving only drifting leaves and silent moonlight behind. Claire stood frozen beneath the glowing sky, unable to explain why she felt she had not just seen a monster. Somehow, she felt she had just looked into the eyes of someone desperately waiting to be saved. 7 days earlier, long before the mysterious meeting beneath the full moon, the quiet village at the edge of the northern forest had already decided what kind of person Claire Bennett was without ever trying to know her heart. To most of the villagers, she was simply the rejected Omega who lived alone in a small wooden cottage surrounded by wildflowers and herbs. Children often waved at her with innocent smiles before their parents gently pulled them away, whispering old superstitions that claimed an unwanted Omega could bring misfortune. Claire never argued. She had learned years ago that kindness spoke more clearly than wounded pride. Every morning before sunrise, she carried a woven basket into the forest to gather healing plants covered with cool morning dew. By the time the first rays of sunlight reached the village, she was already preparing herbal remedies for anyone who knocked on her door, whether they welcomed her presence or not. An elderly farmer with aching joints, a young mother worried about her feverish son, and even travelers passing through the valley all found the same gentle smile waiting for them. Few could afford to pay, and Claire never asked them to. She believed healing was not something that should belong only to those with wealth or status. Even those who quietly mocked her often returned home carrying medicine wrapped carefully in soft linen. As the days passed, Seasons changed, but Claire remained the same. She repaired broken fences for elderly neighbors who barely thanked her, gathered firewood for widows before winter storms arrived, and left baskets of fresh bread outside homes where hungry children lived, never revealing who had brought the gift. Sometimes she wondered what it might feel like to be accepted, but she never allowed loneliness to harden her heart. Late one peaceful afternoon, while gathering moon herbs near a shallow stream deep within the forest, Claire heard an unfamiliar sound hidden beneath the gentle flow of water. It was soft, almost like tired breathing. Setting down her basket, she carefully followed the sound until she reached a quiet clearing where a large black wolf rested beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree. One of its front legs carried a deep scratch tangled with broken branches, and although its powerful body suggested incredible strength, exhaustion surrounded the magnificent creature like an invisible shadow. The wolf slowly lifted its head as Claire approached, its steel-gray eyes remaining alert but strangely calm. Every story she had ever heard warned her to run from creatures like this, yet something inside those watchful eyes reminded her of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. Without making sudden movements, she knelt several feet away and spoke in the same gentle voice she used with frightened children. The wolf never growled. It simply watched as she carefully cleaned the wound with fresh water before applying crushed herbs and wrapping the injured leg with clean linen torn from the edge of her own cloak. When she finished, Claire quietly placed a small pouch of dried meat beside the wolf before standing once more. "You should not have to face the night hungry," she whispered with a warm smile. The wolf continued watching her in complete silence until she disappeared among the trees. Hidden high above the clearing, Captain Lucas Hayes lowered the spyglass he had been using during a routine patrol. His expression slowly changed from curiosity to disbelief. He had spent months searching for clues surrounding the mysterious black wolf, and now he had witnessed something no soldier would ever believe. The feared creature had allowed a rejected Omega to stand within arm's reach without showing even the smallest trace of aggression. Lucas remained perfectly still as one impossible question echoed through his mind. Why had the black wolf trusted her? Captain Lucas Hayes did not leave the forest until the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the western hills. The image of the rejected Omega calmly treating the mysterious black wolf remained fixed in his thoughts during the entire ride back to the royal palace. He had spent nearly a year tracking every rumor surrounding the legendary creature that appeared beneath each full moon. Yet nothing he had witnessed prepared him for what he had seen that afternoon. The black wolf had not acted like a wild beast. It had stood perfectly still, allowing Claire Bennett to approach without fear, almost as though it recognized something within her that no one else could see. By the time Lucas reached the palace gates, night had settled over the kingdom, and another full moon was only days away. Inside the royal palace, silence carried a weight that every servant understood without speaking aloud. The eastern wing had already begun its familiar preparations. Heavy iron doors were inspected. Ancient locks were tested. Thick curtains were drawn across tall windows overlooking the mountains. Every full moon followed the same routine, and every servant quietly obeyed without asking questions. Deep within the highest tower, King Alpha Adrian Blackwood stood alone before a large window overlooking the moonlit valley. His regal black clothing rested perfectly across broad shoulders, yet nothing could conceal the exhaustion behind his steel-gray eyes. He watched the moon rising above the distant forest with quiet resignation instead of anticipation. Each passing month reminded him that the curse had never truly weakened. It merely waited. A soft knock interrupted the silence before royal healer Margaret Ellis entered the chamber, carrying a polished wooden case filled with carefully prepared herbal remedies. She had served the royal family for decades and had searched tirelessly for a cure that never came. Gently placing the medicines upon a nearby table, she met Adrian's gaze with quiet sadness. The herbs eased the pain after each transformation, but neither of them believed they could stop what was coming. Moments later, High Elder Samuel Hawthorne joined them, his weathered face revealing the burden of ancient knowledge. He quietly unfolded an old parchment covered with faded symbols passed down through generations of royal advisors. According to every surviving record, no Alpha King touched by the Black Wolf curse had ever escaped its grasp. Samuel respectfully urged Adrian to prepare once again for another night behind the sealed tower doors. Adrian slowly turned away from the window. "How many years must my people fear their own king?" he asked quietly. No one answered. The silence itself became the only honest reply. As the meeting ended, Lucas arrived carrying news from the northern forest. He carefully described everything he had witnessed, choosing every word with precision. Margaret listened in disbelief while Samuel's expression gradually changed from skepticism to thoughtful concern. A rejected Omega had approached the Black Wolf without suffering harm. More astonishing still, the creature had remained calm throughout the encounter. Adrian remained silent, but something deep inside him stirred at the unexpected report. For years he had awakened after every full moon with only scattered memories, fragments of moonlit forests, cold rivers, and an overwhelming loneliness that refused to fade. Now, for the first time, another piece of that forgotten night had surfaced. Someone had looked into the eyes of the Black Wolf without seeing only a monster. Samuel carefully rolled the ancient parchment closed before speaking almost in a whisper. "Perhaps we have been searching for answers inside these walls while the truth has been waiting beyond them." Adrian slowly lifted his eyes toward the moon once more. Somewhere beyond the palace, an unknown Omega had unknowingly crossed paths with the greatest secret in the kingdom, and none of them realized that a single act of compassion had already begun changing a destiny written long before any of them were born. The following morning, a gentle mist drifted through the northern forest as Claire Bennett finished watering the small garden beside her cottage. Fragrant herbs swayed beneath the cool breeze while birds greeted the new day with cheerful songs, creating a peaceful beginning that gave no hint of how quickly her quiet life was about to change. She had just finished wrapping fresh medicine for an elderly neighbor when the distant sound of approaching horses echoed along the narrow woodland path. Curious villagers stepped outside their homes, whispering as four royal guards dressed in dark blue cloaks entered the village with Captain Lucas Hayes riding at their head. Few members of the Royal Guard had ever traveled so far from the capital, and their unexpected arrival immediately stirred both curiosity and fear. Claire calmly stepped onto the front porch of her cottage, brushing a loose strand of golden blonde hair away from her face as Lucas dismounted from his horse. Unlike many others who looked at her with quiet judgment, his expression carried only respect. He placed one hand over his heart before speaking. "Miss Claire Bennett, His Majesty requests your presence at the royal palace." The entire village seemed to fall silent. Several people exchanged confused glances, while others quietly muttered that an unwanted Omega could not possibly have any business inside the king's palace. Claire herself looked equally surprised. She searched Lucas's face for some sign that this might be a misunderstanding, but his calm expression never changed. "There must be someone else you intended to find," she said softly. Lucas gently shook his head. "No mistake has been made." Before Claire could ask another question, a familiar elderly woman from the village slowly approached with the help of a wooden walking stick. Years earlier, Claire had quietly cared for her through a difficult illness without accepting a single coin in return. The old woman reached out and gently squeezed Claire's hand with a warm smile. "Sometimes the road we never expected becomes the one we were always meant to walk," she whispered. Those simple words settled gently into Claire's heart. She looked back toward her small cottage, the only home she had ever known. It contained little more than shelves of dried herbs, handwritten journals filled with healing remedies, and memories of countless quiet mornings spent helping others. She carefully packed a few changes of clothing, several pouches of medicine, and the worn leather notebook where she had recorded every healing plant she had ever discovered. As she closed the cottage door behind her, a single white feather drifted slowly from the sky, landing softly upon the doorstep. Claire picked it up with quiet curiosity before placing it carefully between the pages of her journal without understanding why it felt important. The journey toward the capital lasted most of the afternoon. Rolling green hills gradually gave way to broad stone roads leading toward towering castle walls that rose proudly above the valley. The closer they came, the more nervous Claire became. She had heard countless stories about the Alpha King throughout her life, yet none of them painted the picture of a kind ruler. Most described a powerful monarch surrounded by secrets and impossible expectations. As the palace gates slowly opened before them, Claire drew a slow breath, trying to quiet the uncertainty growing inside her. High above the courtyard, unseen behind a tall window, Adrian Blackwood watched the arriving riders in thoughtful silence. He had agreed to meet the mysterious Omega only because every other answer had failed him. Neither of them knew that the moment Claire crossed the palace threshold, the course of both their lives quietly began to change, guided by a destiny that had waited patiently for far longer than either of them could imagine. Claire Bennett expected cold marble halls and distant royal formalities, but she did not expect the silence. The palace was beautiful beyond anything she had ever imagined, yet every corridor seemed wrapped in an invisible weight that no amount of luxury could hide. Servants lowered their voices whenever they passed one another. Guards remained unusually alert even during peaceful daylight, and every window facing the eastern tower stayed firmly closed despite the pleasant spring breeze outside. Captain Lucas Hayes quietly guided Claire through the endless hallways until they reached a bright conservatory overlooking the royal gardens. Flowers from every corner of the kingdom filled the room with gentle fragrance, yet many of the rare white moon lilies growing beside the windows had begun to wilt without explanation. Royal healer Margaret Ellis welcomed Claire with a warm smile that carried genuine kindness instead of curiosity. Unlike many others, she did not see an unwanted Omega standing before her. She simply saw another healer. Margaret invited Claire to examine several unusual medicinal plants that had recently stopped responding to every known treatment. Claire carefully knelt beside the fading flowers, touching one fragile leaf with remarkable gentleness. She studied the soil, smelled the roots, and quietly observed the sunlight reaching the glass ceiling before speaking. "There is nothing wrong with the plants," she said softly. "Something around them has forgotten how to live." Margaret looked at her with surprised admiration. Those were almost the exact words she had written privately in her own journal only days earlier. Before another question could be asked, the heavy wooden doors slowly opened. Every servant immediately stepped aside as King Alpha Adrian Blackwood entered the conservatory. Claire rose respectfully, lowering her eyes as royal custom required. Yet she could still sense the quiet strength surrounding the man whose name had become legend throughout the kingdom. Adrian studied her in silence. She looked nothing like the frightening stories whispered by nobles about rejected Omegas. Her simple linen dress carried the faint scent of lavender and fresh herbs. Her expression remained calm despite standing before a king, and there was not the slightest trace of ambition hidden within her eyes. "You are the healer from the northern forest," Adrian finally said. Claire nodded gently. "I only try to help where I can, Your Majesty." Adrian's expression remained composed. "Captain Hayes tells me you approached a black wolf without fear." Claire hesitated before answering honestly. "I was afraid. I simply believed the wound deserved attention more than my fear deserved obedience." Her quiet words settled over the room. Adrian looked away for a brief moment, as though something deep within him had unexpectedly stirred. He had spent years believing everyone who approached him did so because of his crown or feared him because of the curse hidden behind it. Yet this young woman spoke only about compassion. As their conversation ended, Margaret discreetly excused herself and made her way toward the palace archives. Something Claire had said continued echoing through her thoughts. If the plants reflected the condition of what surrounded them, perhaps the ancient curse had never been rooted in magic alone. Hours later, while searching through forgotten shelves covered with dust, Margaret discovered an old leather-bound manuscript hidden behind damaged scrolls. Inside were faded writings describing an ancient affliction carried by an alpha ruler whose spirit had become isolated by fear rather than consumed by darkness. Her heartbeat quickened as she continued reading. The final pages were missing, but one surviving sentence remained perfectly clear. "The curse weakens when a heart untouched by fear chooses compassion before judgment." Margaret slowly closed the manuscript, realizing that the answer the kingdom had sought for generations might not be hidden inside ancient spells at all. It might already be walking the halls of the palace carrying nothing more extraordinary than a basket of herbs and an unbreakable heart. As sunset painted the western sky in fading shades of gold and crimson, an uneasy silence settled across the royal palace. Servants quietly finished their duties earlier than usual. Heavy wooden doors throughout the eastern wing were carefully secured, and every hallway leading toward the highest tower slowly emptied until only the soft echoes of distant footsteps remained. Claire Bennett noticed the unusual change almost immediately. Throughout the day, everyone had treated her with quiet courtesy, yet as darkness approached, even the bravest guards seemed unable to hide the concern in their eyes. She found Captain Lucas Hayes standing near an arched window overlooking the forest, his attention fixed upon the enormous full moon slowly rising above the distant mountains. "Does something happen tonight?" she asked gently. Lucas hesitated before answering. "Tonight is the full moon." Those 4 words carried a weight that needed no further explanation. Moments later, Royal Healer Margaret Ellis hurried toward them holding the weathered manuscript she had discovered earlier that afternoon. She requested an immediate audience with King Adrian Blackwood before the moon reached its highest point. Inside the royal library, Adrian listened quietly as Margaret carefully explained the forgotten passage, describing an ancient curse strengthened by fear and weakened through compassion freely given. High Elder Samuel Hawthorne studied the faded pages with growing disbelief. Every surviving record the Royal Council had trusted for generations had focused only on containing the curse, never understanding its true nature. Adrian slowly closed the manuscript after reading the final surviving sentence. "If these words are true," he said softly, "then every generation before us has been fighting the wrong battle." Outside, the full moon climbed higher into the night sky. Deep within the eastern tower, Adrian prepared himself for another transformation, fully expecting nothing to change despite the hopeful discovery. Before entering the chamber where he willingly isolated himself each month, he turned toward Claire. "Whatever happens tonight, you must remain inside the palace." Claire met his steel-gray eyes with quiet understanding. "I cannot. Promise that if someone needs help." Adrian almost smiled for the first time in years. There was no defiance in her answer, only honesty. As the enormous iron doors slowly closed behind him, an overwhelming stillness spread across the palace. Hours passed. Then, from somewhere beyond the tower walls, a long mournful howl drifted across the moonlit valley. Claire's heart tightened instantly. Without waiting for permission, she quietly followed the narrow stone staircase leading toward the hidden courtyard behind the eastern tower. The ancient gates had been left slightly open by servants who had fled moments earlier. Moonlight flooded the courtyard, illuminating the towering black wolf standing alone beneath the glowing sky. Its powerful body trembled as though struggling against an invisible burden, yet instead of charging into the darkness as legends claimed, it remained rooted in place. Claire slowly stepped into the silver light, without fear clouding her judgment. She recognized those steel-gray eyes immediately. They were the very same eyes that had watched her from the forest clearing days before. "Adrian," she whispered gently. The enormous wolf slowly lifted its head. Every muscle remained tense, but it did not move toward her. Claire took another careful step. "You are not alone anymore." For one endless moment, the moonlit courtyard fell completely silent. Then something extraordinary happened. The fierce tension surrounding the black wolf gradually eased. Its breathing became slower, calmer, and the restless sorrow inside its eyes softened into quiet recognition. High above the courtyard, Margaret, Samuel, and Lucas watched in stunned silence from the tower balcony. None of them had ever witnessed the black wolf grow peaceful beneath a full moon. As silver moonlight wrapped gently around Claire and the great wolf standing before her, Margaret realized the forgotten manuscript had spoken the truth. The curse had not begun to break because of ancient magic. It had begun to break because someone had finally chosen compassion before fear. Morning arrived beneath a sky clearer than anyone at the palace could remember. For the first time in many years, the servants opened the windows of the eastern tower without hesitation, allowing fresh mountain air to sweep through halls that had long been filled with quiet apprehension. Claire Bennett stood in the palace garden gathering dew-covered herbs while the memory of the previous night lingered gently in her thoughts. She had not witnessed the curse disappear, yet she knew something profound had changed the moment the black wolf recognized her voice instead of surrendering to its endless loneliness. Nearby, the once fading white moon lilies had begun standing tall again, their delicate petals catching the morning sunlight with renewed life. Royal Healer Margaret Ellis carefully examined the flowers before looking toward Claire with growing certainty. She no longer believed their recovery was a coincidence. Everything within the palace seemed connected to the heart of its king. Inside the royal chamber, Adrian Blackwood slowly opened his eyes after the most peaceful sleep he could remember in years. Usually, every full moon left him exhausted, his memories scattered into meaningless fragments. This morning felt different. He remembered the moonlit courtyard. He remembered hearing someone gently speak his name. Most surprisingly, he remembered feeling calm instead of consumed by fear. As he looked into the polished mirror beside his window, he noticed that the faint silver markings that usually lingered along his arms after every transformation had nearly vanished. Margaret quietly entered the chamber carrying the ancient manuscript. She smiled with relief before explaining what she had observed throughout the palace. The flowers had recovered overnight, the eastern gardens felt strangely vibrant again, and Adrian himself showed signs no previous Alpha King had ever experienced. High Elder Samuel Hawthorne soon joined them, holding another collection of forgotten royal records discovered before sunrise. Hidden inside a weathered chest beneath the oldest archive room, he had uncovered several damaged journal pages written by an ancestor who had survived the earliest years of the curse. Although much of the writing had faded, one passage remained readable. It explained that the Black Wolf was never meant to be destroyed because it was not born from hatred. It was created from an alpha ruler's overwhelming fear of becoming isolated from those he wished to protect. Only genuine trust freely given could restore balance between the man and the wolf. Samuel slowly lowered the pages, realizing that generations of rulers had misunderstood their own history. They had imprisoned themselves when they should have learned to trust another heart. Later that afternoon, Adrian found Claire tending the recovering moon lilies in the palace garden. He quietly thanked her for what she had done the night before, but Claire gently shook her head. "I did not defeat anything," she replied softly. "I only refused to see you as something to fear." Adrian looked across the blooming garden, reflecting upon words no one had ever spoken to him before. Every person he had met since childhood had either respected the crown or feared the curse. Claire had done neither. She had simply seen another soul carrying a burden. Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Lucas Hayes, who arrived with surprising news from nearby villages. Rumors had already begun spreading that the terrifying howls usually heard throughout every full moon had fallen silent before dawn. People who had hidden behind locked doors now stepped outside, speaking not about fear, but about hope. Adrian quietly watched the sunlight dancing across the white blossoms surrounding Claire, realizing that something greater than his own healing had begun. The kingdom itself was slowly changing. Yet deep inside the ancient archives, Samuel continued reading the final damaged pages with growing concern, because one unfinished sentence hinted that the curse would not completely disappear until the Alpha King made a choice that would determine not only his own future, but the destiny of the entire kingdom. Several days passed beneath unusually peaceful skies, and with each sunrise the kingdom seemed to breathe a little easier. The fearful whispers that had once surrounded every approaching full moon slowly gave way to cautious optimism. Merchants reopened market stalls that had always closed early before. The lunar cycle, children once again played outside until sunset, and families who had spent years living in quiet anxiety began smiling more freely. Yet inside the royal palace, Adrian Blackwood understood that lasting peace would require more than a single miraculous night. If the kingdom was ever going to escape the shadow of the curse, fear itself had to lose its place upon the throne. Early one morning, Adrian summoned the royal council to the Grand Assembly Hall. Nobles, advisors, military commanders, and village representatives gathered beneath towering stone columns, uncertain why the meeting had been called so suddenly. Claire Bennett quietly remained near the back of the chamber beside royal healer Margaret Ellis, never expecting to become part of the discussion. High Elder Samuel Hawthorne stepped forward carrying the restored journal pages that had revealed the forgotten truth behind the Black Wolf curse. Before anyone could question him, Adrian rose from the throne and calmly addressed the entire council. He spoke not about the curse, but about the fear that had ruled the kingdom for generations. He admitted that even as king, he had spent years believing isolation was the only way to protect those around him. Looking toward Claire, he continued with quiet conviction. One person chose compassion when every reason suggested fear. That choice accomplished what centuries of secrecy could not. The hall remained completely silent. Several nobles lowered their heads, remembering how quickly they had judged an Omega they had never truly known. Adrian then made a decision that surprised everyone present. He formally invited Claire to stand beside him before the royal court, not as a servant or honored guest, but as an advisor whose wisdom had already changed the future of the kingdom. Claire hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with such attention, but Margaret gently encouraged her forward. As she stood beside the king, no elaborate speech escaped her lips. She simply looked across the gathering and said, "People heal more quickly when they no longer have to carry fear alone." Those simple words settled into every listening heart. Samuel then presented the ancient writings to the council, explaining that every generation had misunderstood the purpose of the curse. It had never been created as punishment. It had been a trial reminding every alpha ruler that strength without trust would always become loneliness. Adrian immediately announced new laws ensuring that no Omega, regardless of birth or social standing, would ever again face rejection simply because of inherited traditions or old prejudice. The declaration spread throughout the kingdom before sunset. Villages that had once looked upon Omegas with suspicion slowly began opening doors that had remained closed for generations. As evening approached, Adrian and Claire walked quietly through the palace gardens where the white moon lilies now bloomed in full abundance. The king admitted that for the first time since childhood he no longer dreaded the arrival of the next full moon. Claire smiled gently before reminding him that courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing kindness despite it. Adrian looked toward the rising moon glowing softly above the palace towers, feeling hope where despair had once lived. Neither of them noticed that the moonlight reflecting across the garden carried a brighter silver glow than ever before, while somewhere deep within the ancient forest, a single black wolf quietly watched the palace from a distant hillside before peacefully disappearing beneath the trees, as though waiting for one final full moon that would decide whether the ancient curse would become nothing more than a forgotten legend. The final full moon of the season rose slowly above the kingdom, bathing the palace, the forests, and the distant mountains in gentle silver light. Unlike every full moon before it, no frightened families locked their doors, no guards whispered fearful warnings through the streets, and no servants hurried to hide behind heavy walls. Instead, people quietly gathered in courtyards and village squares, looking toward the glowing sky with cautious hope. Inside the eastern garden, Claire Bennett stood beside the blooming moon lilies while Adrian Blackwood approached wearing the same calm expression she had come to recognize over the past several weeks. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Words no longer seemed necessary. The journey that had begun with fear had slowly become one built upon trust. As the moon reached its highest place above the kingdom, Adrian felt the familiar warmth spreading through his body. He closed his eyes, prepared to endure another painful transformation, yet this time he did not walk away alone. Claire remained beside him without hesitation. "Whatever happens," she said gently, "you do not have to face it by yourself." Adrian opened his eyes and quietly nodded. Silver light surrounded them as the ancient power awakened once more. Moments later, standing where the king had been, the great black wolf appeared beneath the moonlight. Its powerful frame towered above the white flowers, its midnight fur reflecting the silver glow that covered the garden. Yet everything felt different. The restless sorrow that had haunted its steel-gray eyes for so many years was gone. Instead, there was calm recognition. Claire slowly stepped closer, her heartbeat steady, and gently placed one hand upon the thick fur along the wolf's shoulder. The magnificent creature lowered its head peacefully, accepting her presence exactly as it had in the forest days earlier. At that same moment, the moonlight surrounding them became brighter than anyone had ever witnessed. Royal healer Margaret Ellis, High Elder Samuel Hawthorne, Captain Lucas Hayes, and countless palace servants watched from nearby terraces as the silver light flowed across the garden like a quiet river. Samuel slowly opened the final restored journal page he had carried with him. Hidden beneath faded writing, another sentence had become visible beneath the moonlight itself. It read, "When an alpha chooses trust over solitude and another heart answers without fear, the wolf and the king shall become one." As the final words were spoken aloud, the silver light gently surrounded the black wolf before slowly fading into the peaceful night. Standing where the great creature had been only moments earlier was Adrian once again, unharmed, his steel-gray eyes clear and peaceful. No shadow of the curse remained. He looked toward the moon, then toward Claire, understanding that the greatest miracle had never been the end of the transformation. It had been the healing of a lonely heart that had carried the weight of an entire kingdom for far too long. Dawn arrived with golden light spreading across the valley, and for the first time in generations the full moon passed without fear. The palace gardens flourished with brilliant white blossoms, the ancient tower doors remained open, and laughter echoed through the castle grounds where silence had once ruled. Adrian fulfilled every promise he had made, protecting every Omega with new laws built upon fairness instead of prejudice, while Claire continued healing anyone who sought her help, never allowing honor or recognition to change the kindness that had always defined her. Years later, parents would tell their children that the kingdom had not been saved by strength alone, but by one rejected Omega who refused to stop believing in compassion, and one Alpha King who discovered that the bravest leader is not the one who never falls into darkness, but the one who chooses to trust another heart enough to find the light again. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.